caption size using the upward arrow next to the start video and stop video button. Next, for those who are in the room, I'd like to invite my colleague, Katie Kalugan, to give us a quick safety briefing.
Hi, folks. For those that are in the room, the location of the restrooms, they're directly behind us over in that corner. And in case of an emergency, we'll head downstairs. And we have two primary points that will meet up, either locations A or B across on Boylston Street and Park Plaza Street. And if you require assistance, let's meet here at this entrance so that we can head down and help you downstairs.
So this evening, we're glad to have you here. We have numerous folks from the MBTA to walk through these proposed changes to our Title VI policies. Again, my name is Lindsay Heffernan. We're glad that you're here this evening. Rachel Morse is here with us, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to her shortly. And Katie Kalugan is here as well, our Directors of Transit Policy and our Deputy Director of Policy Development. We also have Stephen Povich here in the room with us, our Director of Fare Policy, and Melissa Dulay, our Senior Director of Service Planning, is with us on the Zoom, in the Zoom room, should any questions come up that she can help us through. So with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Rachel Morse. Thanks, Rachel. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Rachel Morse, Director of Transit Policy for the MBTA. And tonight we are going to talk about two policies, two civil rights policies that are the MBTA is proposing revisions. These are existing policies that we are seeking to update. The first of those is what we are calling our Service and Fare Change Equity Policy, formerly known as the DIDB policy. And that policy concerns how the MBTA evaluates the equity impacts of proposed service and fare changes, and we'll review how that policy works and our proposed changes. Next, we'll review some proposed changes to the MBTA's public engagement plan, which is the plan that states the principles and procedures that guide the MBTA's engagement with the public about projects and decisions in development. We'll review the changes that we are seeking to make to that policy. And after each of these presentations, happy to take questions and feedback. Starting with the Service and Fare Change Equity Policy, which if you're familiar, you may have seen it posted on our website as the DIDB policy. So this policy is required by the federal government through the Federal Transit Administration through Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VI prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. We also consider whether fare and service changes will place a disproportionate burden on low-income populations. Anytime the MBTA proposes a fare change or a major service change, we must do an equity analysis and ask, will minority and/or low-income riders experience an increased burden or less of a benefit from the proposed change? And our goal is to fairly distribute these effects. When we have a finding of disproportionate burden or disparate impact, we are required to do certain things. If the change will have more of an impact on minority riders, this is called a disparate impact finding, and the team must explain the need for the change and show that there are no effective alternatives. If we learn that the change will place more of a burden on low-income riders, this is called a disproportionate burden finding, and the team must consider any available mitigation measures and any less discriminatory alternatives that may be available before we can proceed with the proposed change. So how does an equity analysis work? When we do a service equity analysis, we analyze different data depending on the proposed change. For example, the MBTA may use its rider census to compare the ridership of the affected routes with the ridership of the system. Or we may use US Census data when we're considering adding new service, such as the Green Line extension. The analysis is then published in a report that states the data used, how the data was collected, and the methods and calculations used in the analysis itself. On occasion, the MBTA will reach out to the FTA for technical assistance. I have here a flow chart for those who are able to see the screen that demonstrates in what we hope is relatively simple terms how a service equity analysis works, and I can go through a hypothetical service change as an example. So the process begins with any proposed change in service. And here for our hypothetical, we're proposing reducing the weekly service hours for the hypothetical Route A bus from 1,350 hours per week to 1,000 hours per week. And so we ask, is this a major service change? And major service change is defined within the policy. We're proposing some revisions to that definition, which I will get to. So we ask, is it a major service change? The answer is yes, if the change will last longer than 12 months and is the change meets one or more of three criteria. Is a change of at least 10% in revenue vehicle hours per week by mode, or 25% revenue vehicle hours per week by route, or 0.3% to base coverage of the entire network. So this hypothetical, reducing weekly service hours for a bus route from 1,350 down to 1,000 would be a major service change because it's a 26% change per week by route. We would do our equity analysis and it would show that this presents a 25% change for minority populations, or a reduction in service by 25% for minority populations, and only a 20% reduction in service for non-minority populations, which exceeds our threshold. And that would tell us this change is unfair. It has a disparate impact because it proposes to decrease service more for minority populations than for non-minority populations. We would have an equity finding, and we would thus need to show substantial legitimate justification for the change, so that we need the change and that there are no effective alternatives before we could proceed with that change. There are also instances where we might propose a service change and an equity analysis is not required. Going back to the bus route hypothetical, if we proposed a minor service change to reduce the weekly service hours by fewer down to 1,200, that would be an 11% change per week by route. This does not meet our definition of major service change, so no equity analysis would be needed before proceeding with that change. Similarly, a short-term service disruption, for example, the shutdown of the Orange Line for 30 days that we saw this past summer, did not require an equity analysis because the proposed change did not exceed 12 months. Its service was always intended and did return to previous levels. Similar process when we propose a fare change, we conduct a fare equity analysis. And we will conduct an equity analysis for any fare, for making any change that would increase or decrease individual or system-wide fares, fares by mode, fares by payment type or fare media, or any change that would result in a de facto fare change by inducing mode shift. For example, if we were to replace a bus route with subway service, you could get from the same point A to the same point B, but it's going to cost more. So that is a de facto fare change. A fare equity analysis compares the percentage change in the average fare for minority and overall riders and for low income and overall riders. For fare type changes and mode shift induced changes across all modes, the MBTA will assess whether minority and low income customers are more likely to use the affected fare type, media, or mode than overall riders, and what the potential cost impact would be to these riders. I have a similar chart to explain a hypothetical fare change. We follow much the same process. The process begins with any proposed fare change. Here in our hypothetical, we're proposing a 25% decrease in commuter rail fares. So does this require an equity analysis? Yes, if the proposed fare change will last longer than 6 months and is not a decrease due to a construction project or something similar. If we offered a discount on a route that was under construction, that's not a fare change. And fare changes do include changes to types of fare and the ways that you might pay. The equity analysis for this hypothetical 25% decrease in commuter rail fares shows a 5% change for a reduction by 5% for low-income riders against a 12.5% reduction for all riders, which exceeds our threshold. And we would determine that this change is unfair and presents a disproportionate benefit to non-low-income riders because it proposes to decrease fares more for all riders than for low-income riders. The MBTA must justify the change and consider mitigations and alternatives before we can proceed. So how do we involve the public on fare and major service changes? As federally required, the MBTA will conduct public engagement for proposed fare and major service changes and their respective equity analyses. Any proposed mitigation measures where potential adverse impacts are identified, including the less discriminatory alternatives that may be available, and proposed changes to the policy itself, which is what we're doing here this evening, including any changes to the definition of major service change and changes to the methodologies we use for evaluating adverse effects. The MBTA board must vote to approve the policy and to indicate their consideration, awareness, and approval of each fare or service equity analysis. We seek public comment, and the process for seeking public comment on fare and major service changes includes all fare and major service changes are presented to the public for a comment period lasting at least 21 days. We set up multiple channels for comment, including a dedicated web page, online forms or emails, a mailing address, and in-person or virtual public meetings or hearings for testimony.
Something just happened with the interpreter Zoom rooms for us to go. Okay.
All right, sorry about that. There we go. Okay, we will resume. Sorry about that interruption. As I was describing the public comment process on fare and major service changes, and saying that we set up multiple channels for comment, including a dedicated web page, online forms or emails, mailing address, and in-person or virtual meetings and hearings for testimony. When we do hold a hearing, the MBTA will make a formal presentation regarding proposed fare changes, and the public will have the opportunity to provide testimony on the proposals for the public record. If an analysis finds an inequity, the MBTA will engage the public to discuss any proposed mitigation measures and less discriminatory alternatives that may be available. MBTA staff reviews and considers input from the public and from the MBTA advisory board on any fare changes or service decreases before presenting a final recommendation to the board of directors for approval and implementation. We go to the next slide, please. So that was an overview of how this policy works. And now ask, why does this policy need an update? For a few reasons, initially to manage limitations of the federal requirements, which assume equity in the status quo, although we know that Title VI is not synonymous with equity. And we're seeking to make some changes to address unexpected and counterintuitive results produced by the current version of the policy, which was last updated in 2017. Some examples of those problems include an inability to consider network effects. The current policy does not account for the rider's experience, such as travel times. It doesn't consider the equity benefits, such as quality improvements. And it relies too heavily on the absolute change ratio, which does not yield informative results. When we talk about the absolute change ratio, it is the simple or total difference for a protected versus a non-protected group, regardless of relative population size, and does not account for proportionality. So we are proposing 5 key changes to this policy. The first is to rename it. We've been referring to it as the DIDB policy, which stands for Disparate Impact, Disproportionate Burden, which is what it measures, but the DIDB doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not intuitive. So we're proposing to rename it Service and Fair Change Equity Policy to more clearly state the policy's purpose and enhance understanding.
我们现在要这个重新开始了。
Second proposed change is to redefine major service change to account for network-wide effects and to clarify when service changes and disruptions do not require a service equity analysis. These changes include replacing the route length metric, the old metric, which stated a change in route length of at least 25% or 3 miles, replacing that with a base coverage metric to count a change of at least 0.3% to base coverage of the entire network as a threshold for a major service change. And we are also seeking to clarify that changes lasting less than 12 months and longer term service disruptions that are accompanied by alternate service or disruptions that are necessary for safety, security, or sustainability, even those lasting longer than 12 months, are not considered a major service change and thus do not require a service equity analysis. The third key change is to improve the service equity analysis methodology. So we might consider more riders with low income and have more reliable results. These changes include increasing the low income threshold from 60 to 80% of median household income in the MBTA service area. And for reference, 60% as of 2015 was $43,415. In 2021, the 80% number was $77,665. And median income, of course, is subject to annual modification. We're also seeking to discontinue reliance on calculations using the absolute change in revenue vehicle hours and the new base coverage metric. As I referred to earlier, that the ratio just does not yield anything practical. The fourth key change is to more clearly state the circumstances that require a fair equity analysis and those which do not. When riders are induced to switch modes, such as from a bus to a subway, in the event the MBTA were to eliminate a bus route that runs parallel to the subway, the de facto fare change that flows from switching modes would require an equity analysis. And fare media or fare payment type changes that may result in an increase or decrease in the fare paid for individual riders would also require an equity analysis. Lastly, the last proposed change is to describe the public engagement and board approval process followed for any major service or fare change. So I will pause here. I know it's a sort of dense policy and we've had a few interruptions, but happy to take questions or comments from folks in the room and also via Zoom. And for those participating in the Zoom meeting, if you have a comment or a question, you can raise your hand by clicking the raise hand button or send a chat to the moderator. Or if you're participating by phone, it's *9 to raise your hand.
Microphone to the back of the room. Question? Oh, Mike.
screen. Yep, now you do.
Hi, my name is Rhoda Gibson, and I would like one of my main issues with some of the changes and the things that are happening is that when there needs to be a shutdown and shuttles are put in place, persons with disabilities, and I don't know if my color has anything to do with it or not, but we are not treated as fairly as everyone else. We can't get on some of the buses that you get to provide as shuttles are not accessible, or they have the lift in the back that is dangerous. And then when the shuttle, when the Orange Line, I live in Malden, so I'm on the Orange Line is my vein to get into Boston. And I have been limiting coming into Boston because of issues on the Orange Line. So when the shutdown happened August and September of last year, I was so frustrated and so humiliated because the van drivers that you have didn't know the route, took me all around the world to get from Malden to wherever I was going. And also, they were rude and they didn't treat us well. And I don't know if it was a color thing or if it was just the ignorance that people have with dealing with the disability community. And when the Orange Line is shut down, we are treated like, well, most of the time in this life, we are treated as second-class citizens. And I hate that. We are not. We have as much right to get on transportation as anyone else. And even the MBTA is not providing for the entire community. And persons with disabilities, myself, is part of the community. I should not have to wait for a van. I should not have to wait and be treated so badly. And when you have contract people driving the vans that have never worked for the MBTA, treat us so bad. It's not fair, it's not right. And the MBTA needs to address when there's shutdowns, not only taking care of the community, the rest of the community, but also make sure that persons with disabilities, especially people like me in a wheelchair, that I cannot get out and fold up and put in a car, treat us just as you would treat everyone else, and make sure that we have the service to get from A to B. I had to spend extra money taking Ubers because of how I was treated. And I can't stand it, and I won't stand for it. And the MBTA really needs to address that, really.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Ms. Gibson, thank you very much. Thank you for coming here tonight. And you're right. We need to do better. I think the issues of that rapid closure around the Orange Line definitely impacted certain individuals significantly more. And thank you for sharing your story with us this evening. I think one of the things that is frustrating for our team is when we are asked to do what is known as an equity analysis, what Rachel just described. Unfortunately, what the federal government tells us that we need to do is look at two discrete populations and look at low-income riders and look at riders that the federal government calls minority. It's a term they use, but riders who are not white or Hispanic, and look at their outcomes compared to everybody else. It does not overlay some of the issues around accessibility, but I hear you loud and clear, and I will certainly follow up with some of my colleagues. I know the proof is in the pudding. I just want you to know there are many people who are trying hard to make sure that we do a better job. And so thank you for sharing that with us this evening, though. I will definitely be taking it back.
there a raised hand online or any? No. Okay. Any other questions or comments on this equity analysis policy? Or we can move on to our public engagement plan.
Great. Hey, folks. Katie Kalugan here to talk about the T's public engagement plan. Just trying to go back a few slides. So I can say that the T's public engagement plan is how we give writers the opportunity to, perfect. Do you mind just like? So the T's public engagement is the opportunity for writers to influence what happens at the T, from service and projects to fair changes, as we were describing earlier, with the understanding that the diverse wants and needs of MBTA writers should help us improve our service and deliver on critical projects. We believe that soliciting and incorporating feedback is a strength and something that we want to do. Further, public engagement is also a part of our Title VI program, so we are federally required to have a public engagement plan. So the T's public engagement plan originally was drafted in 2020, and we developed this plan in partnership with communities, with our writers, and it was really an authority-wide strategy that we undertook. The plan itself provides guidance on how we conduct outreach, our notification procedures, and engagement with external stakeholders like you all. The plan sets forth baseline requirements for public engagement at the T. Again, for any of these projects we were describing earlier, projects can go above and beyond these requirements, but we're still trying to establish a baseline set of standards that folks at the T and people we partner with should follow. This is just a graphic of the guiding principles for public engagement at the T. And these are principles that not only apply to T employees, but also contractors, folks that we partner with to deliver on projects and services. So the first is strong community partnerships. We try to make sure that we go out into the community, rely on our advocate community specifically to help us advocate for certain changes or just getting their input on certain things. The second is strategic and continuous outreach. We want to be sure that we don't enter a community only one time and never follow up. We want to continue to follow up on these certain communities to make sure that projects are followed through. The third is accessibility, equity, and inclusion. We want to be sure that everyone is able to participate in these meetings. Maybe that's including language interpreters, ASL interpreters, or just the physical location of meetings. So in this specific instance, we don't plan on being in just one physical location. We're going out into 2 other communities this week and next week. The fourth is respectful and solution-oriented dialogue. We want to be sure that what we're doing together is productive. We don't want to get stuck on certain issues. We can certainly go back and forth, but we do want to have some sort of path forward together. The last is a transparent process. We try to do our best to make sure that we're sharing as much information as possible. Sometimes we don't have it as quickly as maybe we should, but we still try to do our best to get that information out. So what are our proposed changes to the public engagement plan? They're not as major as to the DIDB policy, but there are a few here. The first is just updating the references to our board of directors. So in our current policy, we mentioned the fiscal and management control board, which now we have a board of directors. The second is clarifying in our guiding principles that equity matters to us. That's always been an underlying thing, but now we're making that explicit. The third is we added community meetings as a common type of engagement. It's always been something we've been doing, but it was never explicit again, like the equity principle. The fourth is expanding our section on virtual public engagement. Since the pandemic, we've been using virtual public engagement strategies like today. And we wanted to make sure that was included in our public engagement plan. The fifth is expanding our accessibility and public engagement section. We'll be adding more information on accessible public meetings, working pretty closely with our system-wide accessibility department. The sixth is requested by the FTA that we add clearer language on what the public comment process is for fair and major service changes. So we're reviewing, updating this public engagement plan and our DID policy as two things that are going together and really complement each other. The last is adding a link to our service and fair change equity policy, what we're talking about today, so that riders can get the definitions for things like a major service change or a major service reduction. So these are just the ways that writers can share your feedback. Of course, for folks who are here in person, we'd love to get your written feedback. You can also use the online form to submit your feedback. We also have an email address here listed. There's a phone number. You can mail in your feedback. You could also visit our webpage dedicated to these changes, which is mbta.com/draft policies. That webpage also includes all the draft policies in 6 different languages and a summary of changes. It's really your go-to page for all of these proposed changes. So I'll pause right here to take any questions or comments on the public engagement plan itself. All right, folks, I'll reiterate the ways that you can share feedback. I know that we just shared a lot of information, and I'm sure there's a lot to also digest. The window for feedback is through April 14th, so there's plenty of time to reflect on what you've heard or attend another public meeting. We have 2 more public meetings left. The second one is tomorrow at our partner location at the Quincy Asian Resources Incorporated in Quincy. That's in person at 6 p.m. Our third public meeting on the topics next week, Tuesday, the 28th. It'll be at our partners at La Colaborativa in Chelsea, again, in person at 6 p.m. We do plan on attending a RTAG meeting. So that's a partnership with our accessibility group. And that's on March 30th, 5:30 p.m. and that is virtual. Again, deadline to provide feedback is Friday, April 14th. And the plan is to present or review all of your comments, come up with updated drafts and proposals, and then present to our board of directors in late April. Again, there are 4 main ways. You can send an email, phone, mail, or submit your feedback via the online QR code. That's it on our end, folks.
There are no raised hands. Are there any raised hands?
Nope. All right.
No questions from people in the room?
All right, thank you so much, folks. We'll close this meeting out. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.